Hello and a warm welcome to the Open Treasury podcast, your go-to source for the latest news and analysis in corporate cash and treasury management. This show is brought to you by CTMfile.com and the Treasury News Network, where treasury professionals learn and share the information that matters most. I am your host Pushpendra Mehta. Joining me today are Paul Galloway, Senior Director, Advisory Services at Strategic Treasurer, and Ben Poole, Writer at CTMfile. Welcome to this edition of the Open Treasury podcast, Paul and Ben.
Thanks, Push. Great to be here.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you in abundance for taking the time to share your thoughts with us on topics that impact the world of cash and treasury management. In today's episode, we shall discuss 4 topics, namely real-time payments pioneer Japan shaking off cash by embracing digital payments, Visa and SWIFT collaborating to streamline international B2B payments, large enterprise finance teams to rely on internally owned generative AI platforms, and finally, new digital trade transaction legislation comes into force in the UK. Our audience can read articles, interviews, and industry roundups by visiting CTMfile.com or by following the links in our show notes. Let's commence today's discussion with our first story, which is about real-time payments pioneer Japan shaking off cash by embracing digital payments. Synonymous with high-tech and innovation, the world's third largest economy, Japan, invented the QR code and launched the first real-time payment system, and yet it was hesitant until some years ago to adopt digital payments. However, the Japanese government's cashless vision, the country's growing e-commerce wave, and its pandemic-driven shift to contactless payments are important factors that are changing digital payments landscape rapidly. A record 111 trillion yen or US $830 billion worth of cashless payments were made in Japan in 2022, up from 95 trillion yen in 2021. That's an increase of 17% from the previous year and marks the first time Japan has crossed the 100 trillion yen threshold as per the Economic Ministry in Japan. The Japanese government is pushing to transition from a cash-dominated society to a digital transaction-driven economy. In this connection, Tokyo is working to promote cashless payments to account for at least 40% of all transactions by 2025 and to 80% in the long run. Paul, several US big tech companies such as Google, Amazon, and Stripe are deepening their presence in Japan's payment sector. From a multinational corporation's treasury department perspective and from your experience of the region, what do you think of the Japanese digital payments market, and is there anything in particular that stands out for you in the Japanese digital payments arena?
Yeah, Push, this article is, really interesting to me. So back in the 70s, Japan pioneered real-time payment system. Back in the 70s. Very forward thinking from that perspective. And to think that Japan today is lagging in terms of real-time payments to India and China, with India leading, China not a little ways back, but India is clearly in the lead. But Japan is still behind, and they invented this stuff. And then they come up with the QR code for making payments, which lots of places are using the QR codes today. You think about COVID. COVID really drove the necessity for cashless payments. It really kind of made it explode. And in some respects, probably helped the adoption rate. So we saw, significant CAGRs over the last 3 years in terms of cashless payments, but in particular in Asia. Asia is leading, and you think about Europe and the Americas were lagging, and I'm not sure why we are, but we are. I expect that's probably going to change over time. US and Europe tends to be a little bit slower adopters, but they'll get in the arena and things will pick up. And once they do, it'll spread widely. But for Japan, it's interesting that they're now looking at this going, listen, we've got too much cash out there trading hands, paper cash. We need to make a shift. And in doing so, they're putting incentives out there to get people to make that transition to a cashless environment. And there's different things out there that I think perhaps are not necessarily new concepts that are pushing some of the younger folks to buy into this idea, the concept of, hey, going cashless isn't a bad thing. They're making it easy, for one. Two, when you think about, I can go back in the days here in the Midwest, there was a furniture store that really promoted buy now, pay later. This is 70s and 80s stuff, a long time ago. That was a really big way of financing the acquisition of needed things in people's homes. They could buy furniture, they could buy a stove or an oven or a washer or dryer or things like that they needed, and not have to pay for it now. They could finance it. And so this buy now, pay later concept is now being digitized. It's an old approach to financing, but it's being reinvented because it kind of went away for quite a while. Credit cards became kind of that tool to buy now, pay later. People could control it, better. But now you're seeing this buy now, pay later is starting to make a resurgence. So it's interesting to see how that's been growing. I expect that will continue. And I can see that happening, on a broader global scale. So I think there's some really interesting things here. Plus businesses, when you talked about Google, other businesses are out there that are adopting these ways to make cashless payments. They have the payment rails, or they're buying into the payment rails so that they have the ability or capability as a non-bank financial to transact with consumers. And I think this makes it really appealing, makes it really easy. Seeing what's going on in Asia writ large, not just Japan, but Asia writ large, it's leading the industry in this arena. I think we'll continue to see that happen in the area. At some point, there'll be saturation because adoption will be near full. It'll be a while before then, but it's certainly picking up pace.
Yeah, Paul, you outlined how Japan almost got there too early with the Zengen system, having faster payments from the 1970s. They've sort of been overtaken a bit by lots of different other parts of the world. And it kind of reminds me of like a parallel with UK faster payments, which wasn't launched anywhere near the 70s. I think that was 2008 that launched, but it was one of the earliest faster payments initiatives in the sort of, I suppose, the new digital era. But that was already 15 years ago. And the UK is actually already overhauling its instant payment system with something called the new payment architecture, which will be all sorts of flashy bells and whistles. It'll be ISO 20022 compliant, things like that. And I think the live date for the MPA is the first half of 2025 as things stand. So the point there is that I don't think you can't stand still with instant payments. And Japan has this complex set of sort of rails and plumbing for their payments. And can they get the velocity they need by just making updates and amendments to what's already there? Or do they need to kind of jump ahead, potentially build a whole new infrastructure that's purely digital focused to keep pace? Or maybe even, again, leap the countries that have leapt ahead of them. I think it's a race, and everyone is sort of kind of going at their own speed. And the one other note, Push, from your article that I really found quite interesting was about the Japanese government lifting the ban on digital salary payments. You say in the article that, this allows companies to pay salaries digitally without going through bank accounts. So just transferring salaries directly to their employees' smartphone payment apps, which is certainly a step towards a cashless society, but, potentially to a bankless society, which is a fun concept to imagine. Maybe not for all of our listeners, but it's just really interesting that they've enabled that. So again, that's one of those leaps, I think, that they're taking. So it kind of underlines the momentum they're trying to build here. And obviously, if that's something that every single consumer wanted to adopt, that would be huge. So I think, for treasurers with operations in Japan and even just generally globally, understanding how their treasury and their accounts can interact and pay out to and accept transfers from digital wallets is something that everyone needs to sort of think about and understand the best ways to do that, and then also sort of manage some of the risk around that as well.
Really good point you made there, your last few comments. When we think about moving to digital wallets, that step to be cashless or bankless, China has been instituting various things to allow for that to happen so that transactions in China are happening without banks being involved. And I think in Asia, there's just that push to take that next step, which, is, again, this is leading. And the other thing China is doing is around their central bank digital coin. They spent a couple of years testing it. They're done testing. They're going to move that thing into production. So they're going to be out with that, I think, relatively soon.
You spot on that. Let's move from Japan's digital payments market story. Let's shift the conversation to the next topic, which is about Visa and SWIFT looking to enhance transparency, speed, and security in global B2B money movement. Visa and SWIFT have announced a collaboration to streamline international business-to-business or B2B payments by strengthening connectivity between their networks that move trillions in value globally. As part of the joint effort announced in Toronto at the annual Sibos conference, Visa will deploy capabilities developed by SWIFT that aim to help increase the speed and certainty of cross-border money movement. Ben, you attended Sibos 2023 in Toronto, Canada, and reported the story for CTMfile. Can you throw more light on the benefits that you think are likely to accrue to corporate treasury or to corporations from Visa and SWIFT collaborating to streamline international B2B payments?
Yeah, thanks, Push. It's fascinating to see two huge payment facilitators, I suppose I describe them as, working together like this. So Visa will use, like you said, certain SWIFT tools, things like payment pre-validation to enable sort of upfront checks of Visa's own B2B Connect payments, which hopefully should reduce delays and can catch errors before a payment is initiated. So trying to bring more efficiency on that side of things. And also using the SWIFT GPI facility, which has a huge amount of sort of tracking potential. So it can track a payment. It can give you visibility as to where a payment is between the payer and the beneficiary, which is often a real pain point in cross-border payments. Often when a cross-border payment leaves the domestic country of a corporate, it could disappear into a black hole until it finally turns up days or even weeks later at its destination, if it turns up at all. So I think anything that kind of adds speed and transparency to this process should be welcomed. And obviously it's something that the banks that work with Visa can then offer to their corporate clients. So it'll be interesting to see what sort of offerings turn up out of this, if it's quite a vanilla option or if banks can get a bit innovative around how they use this partnership to add value basically to their clients. So something for treasurers to look at, and also, I suppose, speak to their banks about, I saw that news. How's that going to help me? How are you going to help me? When you have that functionality enabled.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things additionally that stuck out in this article. One, the ability to make cross-border payments. That's something that I think will be really appealing to banks, customers, having that ability for a payment rail to do that. Sometimes cross-border payments can be challenging. This may be a way to do it more effectively. Plus, you get the SWIFT prepayment validation up front for checks of Visa. That is also another benefit added to this collaboration between Visa and SWIFT. I think that's something else that will be definitely appealing to folks.
Interestingly, Visa weren't the only partnership that SWIFT announced at Sibos in Toronto last week. They also announced a new collaboration with the payments platform Wise, formerly TransferWise, which enables payments sent out securely via SWIFT to complete over Wise with like end-to-end transparency. And this is another interesting partnership. I think the idea behind it is basically to try and disintermediate the correspondent banking network. So rather than having a cross-border payment bouncing between a number of banks potentially before reaching the end beneficiary, it can go directly from the payer's bank to Wise, cutting out those several middlemen in most cases. And again, Wise will be using some Swift tools in the same way that Visa will be, like the payment pre-validation, the GPI, to sort of increase that efficiency and transparency. So the theme of Sibos this year was collaboration in a fragmented world. I think I got that right. Mm-hmm. So certainly they were doing as they were saying. They were looking to collaborate and try and improve payments in these couple of examples.
Yeah, Ben, that last comment you made, I think is super important when I think about, my days of running a treasury department. The use of a correspondent bank or intermediary bank could be painful at times. So, you're seeing this push along the payment rails to eliminate that step of the process. It just complicates things. It makes it more challenging. And we're seeing it's not necessary in today's environment. So these types of collaborations or ways to effectuate payments securely along existing payment rails without having to utilize an intermediary, it creates less risk. So execution risk becomes less because you don't have that extra step. So I think that is something that is also extremely appealing to treasurers.
Those are great points. Let's move forward with our next topic for discussion, which is about large enterprise finance teams likely to rely on internally owned generative artificial intelligence platforms. By 2026, 80% of large enterprise finance teams will rely on internally managed and owned generative artificial intelligence or AI platforms trained with proprietary business data, according to research from Gartner. The recent entry of a large, well-established companies into the generative AI market has kicked off a highly competitive race to see who can deliver revolutionary value first, said Mark McDonald, Senior Director Analyst in the Gartner Finance Practice. Leadership teams do not want to fall behind peers. However, as the chief steward for an organization's financial health, CFOs must balance the risks and rewards of tools like generative AI. Paul, from a treasury viewpoint, what do you think organizations should bear in mind while relying on internally managed and owned generative AI platforms?
This is an area that is really exploding right now, and it's super new, right? There's a lot of unknowns. If I'm a CFO or treasurer of an organization, thinking about the introduction of AI, whether it's external or internally built. In this case, the article's talking about the internal side of things. I need to make sure that I understand how this particular tool functions and operates and what the risks are associated with something not working the way you intended it to. These platforms can be self-learning, and so they can teach themselves to understand and do things or not do things. When a CFO and a treasurer goes through this process, they're going to have to spend some time educating themselves. They're going to have to make sure that they fully appreciate and understand where in the value chain they can use artificial intelligence, because it can be really beneficial. But once they do that, they have to share that with the leadership and get the buy-in. And that's another step that's going to be perhaps a little more challenging to get people on board. So you got to make sure, one, you're able to communicate and educate how this works, what the risks are, what you're willing to accept or not accept with using this technology. It's probably going to be one of those, it takes more than one conversation to get them on board, because there are a lot of things that people just don't know about that, myself included. I'm still learning about how these platforms work. And you can go out there and you can find 10, 15, 20 of them that do different things for different reasons. And when you build this internally, it's got to be something that works for the organization and how the organization functions or wants to function. This could be really useful tool for forecasting. This could be a really useful tool for reporting and generating thoughts and ideas perhaps that weren't seen, especially when you're talking about the ability to go through data. Lots of data out there nowadays. The use of AI with data could be a really powerful tool. And this is something that treasurers and CFOs could really benefit from when you think about, financial plan analysis. The FP&A team could utilize something like this as well. So I think this is something that we're going to see more finance leaders diving into and looking for the opportunity to utilize this within their organizations to help them be successful and meet their strategic goals, be able to manage risk better, provide better visibility, better forecasting, better reporting, optimizing cash levels. This could be really super powerful in that respect, and also save on time for your teams, which we all know treasury teams, accounting teams tend to be stretched at times to limits that go beyond the normal capacity in a day. So this could be a very useful tool for teams like that.
Yeah, I completely agree with Paul on all those points. ChatGPT, generative AI, these large language models can basically be like the next step of automation, the next level of automation. Like so far, AI in its relatively short life in finance has been able to predict based on existing data sets, or even generate new data sets to help corporates deal with a whole new scenario that they might never have had to encounter before. But what Gen AI can do is provide more automation and sort of less manual clicking away to make that happen. Of course, there's the huge sort of cautionary tale around how corporates deal with their data and training these large language models, which is what Cellent's Mark McDonald is talking about in this story. Governance guidelines for acceptable use are vital, as is understanding where Gen AI specifically shouldn't be used. It's not a panacea, but in the right circumstances, in the right environment, it can be used as, I suppose, like a co-pilot to help Treasury get to where it needs to go. So it's definitely a space. We're going to be talking about it a lot more in the weeks and months to come, I'm sure. But it's fascinating to observe it as it's starting its initial sort of explosion onto the scene that it's had this year so far.
Yeah, when you think about just finance writ large, treasury, accounting, your CFO, your treasurer, organizations, they're in a position where they're seeing something that is front edge, leading, revolutionary in many ways. It's artificial intelligence, the use of technology. It's changing payment rails. It's changing functional currencies. They're paper and coins, that's starting to go away in many cases. So it's less and less. We're seeing all these different things happening out there that are really exciting. So if people are wondering, is finance interesting? It's not just the investment area of finance or lending that is interesting out there. It's all these tools and these new ways of doing things that I think are quite exciting, and people can have a really good career just following along with this technology that's coming out and being part of that, maybe even revolutionary in terms of creating some of this. So a lot of really big things happening out there. I think we're going to see this roll on for several more years before it gets to a point where people are going to say, oh, I think we're in a good spot. We're in a good place, until somebody comes up with the next new way of doing things. But it's going to go on for several years.
Yes, and I think there will be, as you rightly mentioned, anything new in terms of emerging technologies will present tremendous challenges and opportunities. Our next topic pertains to a new digital trade transaction legislation coming into force in the United Kingdom. Lloyds Bank has completed what it believes to be the first transaction under the UK's new Electronic Trade Documents Act, or ETDA, which recently came into force. The ETDA gives electronic bills of exchange, bills of lading, and other commercial documents the same legal footing as paper documents. The legislation is designed to provide UK businesses and participants in the 60 to 80% of trade transactions worldwide subject to English law more flexibility in how they trade. Ben, do you think this new UK legislation will serve as a turning point for a faster and more efficient trade transaction system and thereby positively impact corporate treasury?
Yes, is the short answer, Push. The longer answer is, there's been a lot of talk about different solutions and ways to digitize trade and supply chain and trade finance and all of that space. But for something to be able to be used worldwide, you need the legal infrastructure to be able to do so. And B2B documents such as bills of lading, which are used to help importers and exporters complete transactions. That's bills of exchange. Bills of lading is contracts between parties involved in shipping goods. Have to this point needed to be paper-based due to these laws that are historic and stretch back hundreds of years. So this new act allows businesses to use electronic trade documents, but also crucially doesn't force them to do so. So it's something that companies can adopt at their own pace. Last October, when the new law started its parliamentary journey, the UK government stated that electronic trade documents increase security and compliance by making it easier to trace records, for instance, through the use of blockchain and distributed ledger technology. So that's the tech that underpins this and is part of the idea of why they pursued this quite aggressively to get that into law. And as the Lloyd's story notes, 60 to 80% of trade transactions worldwide are subject to English law. So it will have a very real impact on global trade pretty much immediately. The Lloyd's transaction happened the day the law came into effect. So they clearly had this lined up and ready to go for a little while. And they were able to go on the B of the bang of the starting gun to get out of the gates first. So 60 to 80%, that's huge. But for the rest of the world that isn't following English law in the trade sphere, the UN's model law of electronic transferable records, or MLETR, is kind of the global equivalent that other countries will be looking at. And already that's been adopted in places like Papua New Guinea, Belize, Bahrain, Paraguay, the Abu Dhabi global markets in the UAE and Singapore. And large countries such as India, within the framework of the G20, has expressed preliminary interest in MLETR, although that's in the early stages. And China, with collaboration through the Asian Development Bank, has also demonstrated an interest in MLETR. So the thing with the MLETR, I suppose, is that individual countries will adopt it at their own pace. There's not one huge step forward, and lots of the G7 countries are getting there, but they've not adopted it yet. So the UK has kind of taken that first step. Other countries aren't very far behind. So you do need to be thinking digitally with trade as a corporation, as a multinational corporation, particularly.
This article for me was really educational because this is something that I wasn't aware of. Didn't know anything about this act till I read the article. What stood out to me were a couple things. One, the speed along trade finance settlement, cutting it down to by 2 days at least. That's 48 hours. That's tremendous. So there's a lot of power in that. And of course, I think about put on my corporate finance hat. I always like getting cash today versus tomorrow. It's always worth more to me because I can do something with it. I can invest it, put it to work right away. So getting the cash quicker from my perspective is super valuable. It settles the trade quickly. So both counterparties are happy because they're able to get supplies sooner. And the person, the group that they're buying it from, they're able to get their cash sooner. So the trade sells quicker. Both parties are happy. I think this is something that is really valuable. The other thing that I like is being able to eliminate paper. Back in the day when I started moving this way, this was some time ago, I just told myself, I just don't like having a bunch of paper. I really don't. So I want to try to do everything electronically if I can. Yeah, I didn't think anything about the environment. I just thought it's more efficient to have it electronically for me. than to have it on paper. This eliminates the use of paper. So it's environmentally friendly too for people that, where that's important, they're going to like this.
Finally, what is your choice of the biggest or the most important story of the past week and why? Ben, if I can start with you, you were at Sibos. Did you hear, watch anything that you find interesting or some conversations that you have? Anything in particular that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I was in sessions all day, every day of Sibos, so running between all the different conference rooms, although thankfully most of them were on the same floor in the same place in the Toronto Convention Centre. I do think, this story about the UK trade, because it was timely, because it was happening last week, and there was a real trade finance thread at Sibos, this topic came up a lot there. So it's something that a lot of corporates, but obviously a lot of banks are looking at very closely because it's something of huge interest to them in terms of their role in funding these transactions to a certain extent. So I think it's something that everyone has their eyes on. And the fact that we had this transaction come out immediately and you already can just see how it works and hear from the two corporates that were involved in the trade, and the fact that it covers up to 80% of global trade transactions, I think that's the hook there. So yeah, for me, that was the kind of the biggest story. So I was glad I was able to report it while I was over there.
Great job on that, Ben. Paul, what would your final choice or final story of the week be?
Yeah, it's pretty clear cut for me here in the U.S. It's what's going on in Washington, D.C. Our congressional leaders right now are debating passage of the next funding bill at the budget, raising the budget, the debt ceiling in particular. That's what they're talking about. I've said this for decades. I've talked about it for decades. Why are we kicking this issue down the road? We continue to do that. And now it's gotten to a point where it's like every time we have to broach this conversation, it's monumental effort to get something across the finish line so that we can continue to have the government funded. I think this is a huge problematic issue that I would like to see our government leaders actually come together, work across the aisles, and find an appropriate solution, because we can't just spend and we can't say that we're not going to spend. We have to have a balance of that, and we don't have that. And there's even disagreement amongst parties. People within the same party are, debating various aspects of the bill to pass it. And if you can't get agreement within just a party, how are you going to get anything passed? Well, that's kind of where we're at right now. And so it feels like we're going to be running to the 11th hour this weekend to get something that's acceptable. I suspect we're going to get there, but there's going to be a lot of posturing and positioning to get there. I just think we got to stop doing this. We've got to come up with a better solution than what we've been doing. It's not working, at least in my opinion.
Well, thank you, Paul and Ben, for your discerning analysis and insights. We would also like to thank our CTMfile audience for joining us on this edition of the Open Treasury podcast. Please subscribe and look in the show notes for the article links. Thank you and have a terrific week. This podcast is provided for information purposes only, and statements made by CTMfile or guests on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, or consulting advice. For more information, visit ctmfile.com.